Hey everybody, and I'm just checking to see if my Facebook Live is ready here. Looks like it is ready. Okay, so I just wanted to tell a couple stories today on the topic of the title of this video, which is why parents can't trust the schools to educate their children. Because I often see parents complaining about the school didn't teach my kids this, or they didn't teach them that, or why do they teach them this and why don't they teach them this? And it's a very common thing. And a lot of times when a child rather brings home a bad grade from school, the parents are upset and they're like, why didn't the teacher teach this or whatever? Sometimes they blame the kid. It doesn't always end up them blaming the child. But usually when it gets really severe, they end up blaming the schools to some degree. And I was actually talking to one of our TechnoTutor distributors just a few days ago, I think, or last week or something. And he was telling me about how he had met with a family recently where the they had a teenager, so a kid in high school who was doing poorly with his algebra class. And the mother obviously was very concerned about it because he was about to go on to college pretty soon, and he needed to get things up to speed and so forth. And when this distributor was sitting down and looking at everything and seeing where the student was at, he couldn't even do very basic math, even to the point where if you asked him what's the difference between 8 and 7, he didn't even understand that the word difference in that context meant subtracting 8 minus 7, and like what fractions were and how fractions work, and just very, very basic things. And the mother was upset that he was doing poorly in algebra too, but really wasn't even aware of the degree to which this child, although he was a much an older child, basically almost at the end of legal childhood, was totally lacking in just basic understanding of math. And I saw a post on Facebook of somebody posting about their child's homework, and I think this was in the UK, and they were using a term which you don't see often. I'll admit, you do not see this often in elementary or really any school. Even in university, you won't even necessarily come across the specific word that was being used with regards to irrational numbers and so forth. And the parent was like, saying that their brain was melting down because there was like this word that they had never seen before being used, even though they did well in math in school themselves. And it's obviously a common issue. Now imagine you're a parent who didn't do well in math and you don't even remember anything from what you were taught virtually. And so you're totally just kind of at your wits end trying to help your child. That's why they get tutors and things like that. And obviously children or families who can't afford tutors, their kids just struggle. Now they have resources like Khan Academy and things like that online. So the reality is there's no excuse to say like, well, we didn't have access to the information. I mean, unless you're just super poor and you don't even have internet or anything like that. I understand there's a majority of the population of the world who's not in a position to even access things like that. But if you're in a first world country, there really isn't much excuse as a parent to say, well, they didn't have access to information. But what they don't have access to, which is what TechnoTutor addresses, is the ability to use the child's natural learning ability to absorb the information in a way where they actually learn it. Now, that doesn't happen where you just start with algebra, because if they don't have a foundation from the beginning, whatever you put in about algebra, whatever you're absorbing, isn't going to still make sense completely because you don't have the foundation. So you have to start in a sort of progressive way and start from the point where you're actually lacking vocabulary. And I wanted to share a couple stories about that, not in the context necessarily of academics, but just to show you how you can't rely on the school system to make sure that your child gets an effective education, whether you agree or disagree with the curriculum and the content that the school's delivering. Even if you were to agree with the curriculum and the content, you still can't trust the schools to make sure that your child is educated effectively, even in that context. And that's because the school system is not designed to address the natural learning ability of the child. They kind of take each child as they come, like where they're at in their ability to learn. And then sort of that child will get filtered into the particular courses and classes or Like in the States, we have something called gifted classes. We also have remedial classes. We also have special needs, and they have different terms for these in different places. And they change throughout the years what they call these through political correctness and so forth. But basically, you have the classes for the really smart kids, the average kids, the dumb kids, the kids who are considered mentally, what's the word that you'd use now? Handicapped. I don't even know what the correct politically correct term is. But for lack of a better term, children who like have a mental deficit and literally can't even process information at a basic level. And that may be because of some congenital disease. It could be because of some brain damage or lots of other factors. And you might have kids in there that don't actually belong there, but they're not processing information, but it's something that could be corrected. It's not necessarily a physical problem that they're having. But the point is, when you go into the school, they're just going to put you where the teacher and maybe some other, administrators see where that child should be based on their opinion. They're not really actually doing anything to affect the child's ability to learn. It's like, for example, it'd be like if you went to the gym, okay, and there was a bunch of different activities you could do. And so, but all you were allowed to do was do the activities at your current level of fitness. And so you're always, if you come in there with a low level of fitness, you're always going to be doing like tic-tac-toe, because you can't even physically do much. You get tired if you even walk down the stairs. But if you're super fit, then you're playing, racquetball, or you're playing basketball or whatever. And so depending upon your fitness level, you're going to be placed into a certain category, and then you're going to be educated in that way. And that fitness level in school is your just ability to rapidly absorb information or easily naturally absorb information. But what a lot of parents don't realize is that ability to sort of naturally absorb is something that we all have. Now, depending on a person by person basis, you can either absorb very quickly, or it might take a little bit more time. But you actually can utilize that natural learning ability, even in the context of school, but the teacher themselves can't do that. And that's really what it comes down to. For those of you who have TechnoTutor, know what it is. For those of you who don't, it's a technology that allows you to work with your natural learning ability. That way you can make sure when you're learning information, you're actually building it in physically, integrated into yourself, so that you're able to process that information in an unconscious, competent way. So in other words, think of it like a computer. When you put information into the computer, it doesn't, it's not like you have smart computers and dumb computers. They're just computers, and they either process the information or they don't. You can have computers that have a higher capacity to bring in more information. But if you wanted to take your computer and increase its capacity, you would build in more physical connections in the computer, and then you'll be able to process more. It's not like, sorry, my computer's just dumb. You could physically alter it, and then it would increase its capacity. And the truth is, you can do that with human beings as well. It's sort of like the secret that's in plain sight in a way, in the education system. And I've done many videos on this on my YouTube channel. I have one called The Red Pill of Education. And I also have one called Why Your Kids Can't Read and Why It Matters, something like that. It's on my playlist. And many other videos addressing these points as well. Also, there's one I have on there called, I think it's called like the number one myth in education, which is addressing this point that we all learn differently, which is not true. And you can go watch my video to see why I say that and what my perspective is on that. But everything I'm sharing is backed up by all of the research, and everything is just many people can't actually process that information because they weren't supported from a very young age to process information in the best way. So to kind of get to some of the stories I wanted to tell, my son, Max, he's 3.5. He'll be 4 at the end of October. And recently we've been going to the playground down the street to play with a little boy that comes there because his mother is a nanny for one of the kids in that neighborhood. And one time when I took Max to the playground, this was just like last week, he started playing with this kid who's only a month younger than Max is. And I started playing with him, and they got along really well. And Max asked me to take him back. And it turns out that his mom takes him there pretty much every day when they're there at that house doing the nanny position. And so I started taking Max there. We've played with the kid, I think 3 times, 2 separate days. And, I've been sort of building a relationship with the mother, like chatting with her and so forth. But she's also there uh, most of the time focused on, like a 1-year-old that she's the nanny for while her 3-year-old's playing on the playground equipment. So I've sort of just been there supporting Max and chatting with the mom a little bit and kind of directing Max within playing with the other boy and so forth. And it's really cool to see Max playing with little kids his age, because typically it's him and Katie and I and his sister Seneca, and we're mostly all together all the time. And, he's not in school or anything, so he doesn't play with kids on a regular basis, but that's why we take him out to things. We have friends that have children around his age, and we set up things where they can play and all that stuff. But it was cool to see him playing with this little boy that he didn't know and really getting along with him and everything. And it was pretty cool, the way the mother was interacting with her son when she was interacting. Again, she was mostly focusing on the 1-year-old that she was, in charge of. But when she was interacting with her kid, she was pretty, gentle, kind to him. She wasn't like being overbearing or, super controlling or anything like that. She wasn't yelling at him. I didn't really see her do anything that was overtly, like abusive or anything like that from that perspective. So that's why I was like, okay, cool. I don't have a problem coming back here in this context, and Max can play with this little boy and so forth. And I'm there and everything, because I wouldn't simply just take him over to someone's house and drop him off and let him play. I would really want to get to know the other parent first to make sure that, the way that they're interacting with their child is going to be in a way that's not going to influence Max in a really, detrimental way. And of course, my goal within building any relationship with a parent would just be to support them to see the value of Technotutor for them and their children, so that they can also bring their kids up to the level of where Max and Seneca are at, for example, and beyond. So it's a really cool opportunity also just to network with other parents, going to the playground, things like that. But one of the things that was really interesting is, as Max is playing with this little boy, I'm kind of observing where the little boy's vocabulary level is at. And again, he's basically literally the same age, only a month younger than Max. But one of the things that was really interesting that I picked up on initially was that the little boy, when I would talk to him, or Max would talk to him, or his mother would talk to him, and he would say, okay, he would always say the word ote. And at first I thought it was just something he was saying. And I've heard kids say that before when I was growing up. It was like, I just remember, I have this memory of other kids saying that when I was younger. Nothing specific. It's just, I remembered, something of kids doing that. And, especially like, I remember there was some little girls that I would play with when I was younger that were family friends, and they would always say that. But I heard him say that, in response to something. He said, ote. And I thought at first, maybe it's just something that he says that, his parents think is cute or something, and therefore, he says it every once in a while, or maybe given certain context. But as I was talking to him just casually about, some particular thing that they were doing together, the boys were doing together, and I asked him a question, or I said, hey, you could do this or whatever, the boy said, ote, like very matter of factly. Like, in other words, it seemed pretty clear to me after kind of interacting with him for these past 2 days, he always says that word. And I thought that was interesting, like, because it could just be something that the parents, aren't correcting him on because they're they think it's cute. I mean, I don't know. I haven't asked the mother or pointed it out yet. I'm still kind of getting to know her and everything. And but what I noticed today is, so today Max brought a little bucket of toys, like some cars and things like that, with him, that he wanted to bring with him to play with this little boy. And in the bucket, Max asked me to bring his pair of scissors. He has a little pair of child size scissors. They're not the plastic ones that have the little sheet of metal against the plastic. They're like full metal with a plastic handle, but they're just rounded tips. So you can't stab with them, but they are normal scissors. Otherwise, they're metal scissors. They're child size ones. So we brought those with us. And what was interesting, there was a lot of different interesting points within just bringing those scissors, because when we brought the basket and Max immediately wanted to go show the little boy, hey, I brought these toys, the boy noticed the scissors. And Max loves to play with the scissors. He likes to take them outside in the backyard and cut grass with them. He likes to cut stuff like paper or whatever. And we trust him with not cutting things like the sofa, because he'll tell us if he wants to do something, and we'll suggest to him why he should or shouldn't do that and explain why. So he understands that it's not best to cut the furniture. So we pretty much trust him with those scissors, you know. And again, they're not pointed where he can stab with them. But we've also been very specific with, in the very beginning, when we were introducing scissors to him, to sit with him and explain to him how scissors work and let him try cutting things. So he's very effective with them. He knows how to hold them, you know, properly, like real scissors. And he knows that they can cut, like he understands that. So he doesn't, you know, put them close to his face. He doesn't cut his fingers. You know, when he's holding something, you know, he's not going to like hold it like this and try to cut it. He understands that he has to hold it a little bit of ways from it when he's cutting and so forth. He's responsible with them. Like he understands how they work, and he's confident within using them. So it was interesting because when the little boy saw that, he was immediately drawn to the scissors and he wanted to play with those. And, you know, when he first picked them up, like he grabs them, and the mother, you know, was obviously paying attention as well. And she was like, you know, and I won't say the boy's name just because, you know, I want to keep it sort of anonymous or whatever, but she was like, you know, so-and-so, be careful. Let's not play with those scissors. Right. And the boy kind of looked at her and he looked at me, and, you know, I'm not going to sort of, you know, when I'm with other parents and so forth and their children, I'm not going to undermine them as the parent, because that wouldn't be best given the parent and the child relationship. But of course, I'm also there to support and so forth. And especially if it's affecting Max, then I will step in. If the parent is doing something that's going to influence or affect Max. And I don't remember exactly, you know, what the kind of logical progression of events were. But she wasn't telling him he couldn't play with them, but she was like, be careful, like very overly concerned about it. And, you know, he grabbed the scissors and he was like trying to go over to stuff and cutting them like this and so forth. And the mom just kept saying, be careful, be careful. And so I'm sitting there kind of near the boys, right? And she's a little bit further away on the swings with the child she's nannying. And I said to the little boy at some point, I was like, hey, do you know how to use the scissors? And he was like, no. And what I realized in kind of picking up the way the mother was talking about it and everything with him using them is that he's not allowed to play with scissors. Like it was very clear he's not allowed to play with them. Meaning, obviously in this situation, she was allowing it, but I mean, like, it was clear to me just from kind of picking up on things that he wasn't allowed to play with scissors at home. Like that was something probably most likely, just based on the way they were interacting, is most likely a situation where she says, no, you can't play with scissors because they're dangerous, rather than showing him how to do it and teaching him and so forth. And part of the thing is, I don't blame the parent. I understand where they're coming from, because, you know, as parents, when we don't question these things specifically and really dig into this for ourselves, we have all these images that we're impulsed with and implanted with, you know, through TV, through media, through our parents, just through our environment, where we believe that a 1.5-year-old or a 2-year-old is either capable of something or not, but we don't really test it. We don't really put it to the test and see what are they actually capable of. So with Katie and I, you know, with our first child, Max, we were, you know, we wouldn't do something that would put them deliberately in harm's way or anything like that. But like with scissors, we would let him hold the scissors and we would be there to make sure he's not going to cut himself and so forth. And so we introduced things like that very early on. You'd have to ask her to know exactly when, because I don't remember, you know, it was probably 2 years of age or younger, I would assume, I would guess based on just my memory. But we would let him use scissors when we were there. And now he's at the point as a 3.5-year-old where he can go out in the backyard with scissors. We're not concerned about it, you know. And again, they're not the pointed scissors, just to be clear. So we wouldn't give him those, because we know that just by walking and tripping, he could hurt himself, right? So that would be stupid of us as parents to allow him to run around with those, because, you know, he's a little kid and physically he still falls down and things like that, you know. So you have to use common sense within it. It's not about being reckless. It's not about reacting to, well, my parents never let me use scissors, so just here you go, you know. It's not like that. You have to be direct within the point. But because we've made it a part of his environment and he's had opportunities to play with it and so forth, he's become more confident with it. So in other words, the scissors have become a part of his vocabulary, so to speak. And obviously with this other little boy, they were not a part of his vocabulary. He didn't even know how to hold them. and he was kind of just trying to do this, and he was trying to cut some grass and other things. And it was funny because I saw Max like trying to help him understand. He was like, oh, that's not how you do it. Right. And so I asked the little boy, I said, hey, do you know how to use the scissors? And he said, no. I said, do you know how to use them with one hand? And he's like, no. So I said, well, can I see the scissors? So he gave them to me, and I showed him how I put, my thumb in it into the one part, and then I put my fingers in the other, and I can use it. And so he did that. And I said, no, you open your hand and you close it. And he was like, oh, right. And then so it took him a minute because he was kind of, it's like something new. And then he was going around doing that. Right. So now he's using it in a much safer way. All right. So, but then of course, then when the mom saw that, she was like, be careful, not to me to limit the point, but just as he started cutting stuff, she kept reminding him, be careful. And, as I'm talking and he's playing and stuff, he's kind of like waving the scissors around, like keeping them open, like closing them. And so I said to him, and the mom kept telling him, be careful. I said to him, I said, hey, you hear it? Your mom is saying, be careful. That's because if you have those scissors open, and I said, can I see them? And so he gave them to me. And I said, see, watch me. Okay. If I have the scissors open too close, and I started just gently kind of like putting them on my face, I said, see how it can cut my face. And he was like, and I could see his eyes like, oh, and I was seeing, so if I'm not careful, right, I could accidentally poke or I could cut my face. So I always make sure that when I'm holding the scissors and I'm not cutting, that I keep them closed, or I don't, wave them around my face. And he was like, oh, he was like, okay. Right. And then he started, doing the scissors and stuff. So I was just telling him, explaining to him. Right. And I'm also doing that so the mother can see how I'm interacting with him and Max and so forth as well. But this is generally how we operate and work as parents with our kids, is we just explain everything. And many of you probably heard me say that in the past, like we always explain everything. We explain everything. And that's my approach with other children too, is instead of just saying, hey, be careful, because the child doesn't have the context to understand what it means to be careful with scissors, because they don't even know what the consequence would be of them. Right. And so a lot of times what happens is, and this is one of the reasons why parents a lot of times resort to things like spanking or punishment, is they'll say, be careful with those scissors, and the child won't be careful. And then they're like, I told you to be careful. And then they'll end up cutting somebody or hurting themselves or whatever, or they'll hold somebody else. And the parent's like, I'm going to punish you now. I'm going to spank you because you weren't being careful. Like I told you to be careful. You didn't listen to me. And then parents will rationalize it by saying, if you don't spank your kids, or if you don't do these things, they won't learn consequences. Like there's a consequence if you cut somebody. So I need to spank you. So there's a consequence if you don't do what I say. But how many parents are specifically building their child's vocabulary around the scissors, of like what scissors are, which parts of the handle, how do you hold it? Like I was showing this boy, why do you not want to put it near your face? Why do you not want to wave it around other people or run around pointing it at people? How do you actually cut with it? What are things that are appropriate to cut? Why? That's building the child's vocabulary around scissors, right? Because they don't have all of that context. And as parents, we so many times take things for granted that is so obvious to us, but it's become unconscious to a large degree. So being able to be aware that there's a lot that the child doesn't have as context, and that they build the understanding through you explaining things, is what makes them have that context. And this is also why one of the reasons, going back to the point of this video, is why you can't trust the schools to educate your child, because learning how to use scissors, for example, is a part of the child's education. Now, some children end up learning to use scissors effectively, but what's not seen is that in that process of learning it, how much confusion they might have had in that process, or how many other things might have been influencing them. And so that it builds this character where the child eventually at some point starts to lose their natural confidence towards learning new things, or just their self-esteem in general and so forth. So you can look at, okay, but it seems like children are coming out of the school system learning to read and do some basic math and some basic things. But then look at their overall sense of self as to their purpose in life. They come out of school for basically being an employee. I was going to say slave, because that's really what it is. But of course, we wouldn't call it that because we're politically correct, right? But they come out of school after however many years feeling like their purpose in life is to become an employee and just get a paycheck, rather than I'm here to improve this world, to create things, to give to this world, and to use my natural talents and my developed talents and skills and so forth, and to really to leave a mark in this world that's best for everybody. That's not the attitude you come out of school with. You just come out of like, I got to survive, so I got to go get a job. the way in which you're being taught, even though you come out with seemingly some skills and some knowledge and so forth, the way in which you're being taught that stuff is diminishing your self-esteem, is diminishing your ability to learn more. And it's also creating within you a follower sort of mentality, right? So those are some of the consequences when you just abdicate your responsibility to educating your child in that context. But some other just kind of, they might be kind of subtle, but I think they're really cool to point out. So going back to that story, that little boy, I was saying he kept saying the word ote, which there was no time. I know earlier I said he said okay, but that was just me talking. He was saying ote every single time, right? And again, going back, I thought initially that was just sort of a thing he says. Maybe his parents thought it was cute, so it's reinforced or not corrected or something, right? But since we were playing with the scissors, right, at one point he started cutting like some leaves or something, right? And he said, because I think Max was telling him, hey, you shouldn't cut this, you should cut the grass. And that was because Max likes to cut the grass, and that's generally what we tell him is something that's not a problem to cut. And so the boy was wanting to cut some like little tree sprouts or something. So when Max told him that, I said, well, why can't he cut the tree sprouts, Max? And he said, well, because then they won't grow. So he had a reasoning behind it, right? So then I got to have a conversation with them about like, look at all the little tree sprouts. It was like this big oak tree. And I was like, look at all the different tree sprouts that were popping up all around it. And they were like, oh, wow. And I said, now none of those tree sprouts are going to grow into big trees. See how big this tree is? And they were like, yeah. And I said, now they're all really close to it. And this tree takes up a lot of water and has big roots. So these sprouts are only there temporarily. They're not going to grow into big trees. I said, see how far away the next really big tree is? And they looked, and Max said, look at all the sprouts. Look at, and he was seeing all the sprouts under that one. I said, see? I said, so it's okay for us to cut these ones because they're not going to grow ultimately into big trees anyway. So Max was like, oh, okay. So you see, I gave him more context. Instead of saying, don't tell him that, Max, don't try to control him. Like, I gave him more context so he could understand, because from his perspective, it made sense what he was saying, right? So going back to the point more clearly, whenever we were playing with the scissors, right? So, and I'm just giving you context to understand why this point came up, is when Max was telling him, don't cut that, the little boy was asking me, he was like, what can I cut? But he didn't say, what can I cut? He said, what can I tut? What can I tut? And I understood what he meant, but I said, what are you asking me? He said, what can I tut? And I said, do you mean cut? What can you cut? And he was like, yeah, what can I tut? And so now I have a second point where I've noticed it wasn't just ote was one off thing. Now it's, what I'm realizing is it's the k sound, like the C or the K sound, k. He's saying ta. And I said, did you mean cut? Can you say cut? And he said, tut. So he's not hearing that there's a difference. Now, you might think, well, I mean, he's 3.5, he's not going to be able to understand what you're asking him. Well, that is something you could say. And I think based on probably most parents' frames of reference, maybe that's where most 3.5-year-olds would be. But that's not the way it is with my 3.5-year-old, because we're very specific, not only with explaining things, but also utilizing TechnoTutor every single day with him since he was, I think, 10 or 11 months, right? And we've done the same thing with Seneca as well. And with Max, for example, another thing we do, just to give you a kind of a side note, is whenever Max says something that's grammatically incorrect, and I know many times when we're speaking, we're speaking quickly. We don't always use perfect grammar, right? But generally speaking, with a child, they don't already know that there's a perfect grammar. And sometimes as a habit of speech, we might say something incorrectly. And we're not really too concerned about it because it's spoken word versus, written form or something like that. But generally speaking, it's better to use correct grammar, what's our agreed upon correct grammar, because it's more precise and there's less ambiguity and so forth. So whenever Max says something, because he doesn't already know what the correct grammar would be, we'll correct him. And there was a point, for example, with this little boy where, and what we'll do is, the way I do with Max is, if he says, he wouldn't say something like this now, but let's just say he said, I go outside, or let me see a better, more clear example. Like, let's say he said, I wants to go. Okay, let's say he said something like that. I would say, hey, Max, whenever what we would actually say, we wouldn't say I wants to go. We would say I want to go. Okay. Can you say I want to go? And he'll say, I want to go. And I say, okay, cool. And then he'll usually repeat it to himself and then he won't make that mistake again. But I might even give him more clarification. I might say, you might say he wants to go. Like when we're speaking English, we say he wants to go, but we would say I want to go, right? And they want to go. Okay. So I would just give him more context. I would explain it and then he would just absorb it. And then you'll see most of the time, 9 times out of 10 or more, he won't even make that mistake again. So that's the general approach that we take with Max and with Seneca is when they say something that's not grammatically correct, we'll bring it up. We won't ridicule them, obviously. We won't belittle them because we'll just say, hey, we wouldn't say this. In this context, we would say this. And then we explain as much of the why as possible as well. And then if they say it again incorrectly, then we would correct them again later. It's not like we're expecting them to make that change, but in a way, we're assuming that they could. Okay, so we're giving them that opportunity, right? And so that way you've seen with Max, you'll see him compared to other 3.5-year-olds, his grammar is like, it's a total 180 or it's night and day compared to other children. I mean, he speaks in a very complex way. And when we're sitting with this, or when we're playing with this little boy, I'm trying to remember what the exact thing he said was, but it was like, I asked him at one point, I was like, does your mom let you play with scissors at home? And because I was trying to see, like, I think this was right before I asked him, does he know how to use them? It was in the context of that conversation because I wanted to see, like, do you play with scissors a lot? So I can kind of see what support he would need to understand how to use them properly. And I'm kind of paraphrasing because I don't remember exactly, but he said something to the effect of, like, it'd be like he said, my mom don't lets me play with scissors. I mean, it was like, which sounds totally wrong, but that was literally, I mean, I don't know if it was quite literally, but it's pretty close to what he said. He was like, my mom don't let me, or something like that. She don't lets me play with scissors. And I said, oh, okay. I said, she doesn't let you play with scissors? And yeah, she don't let me. And I said, okay, well, you wouldn't say she don't let me. You would say she doesn't let me. Can you say she doesn't let me? And then he just kind of like ignored me and I just let it go. But it was interesting because I don't think he's used to having his grammar corrected. I mean, I don't know. I'm making assumptions, obviously, because I don't know these people very well. I'm still just getting to know them and so forth. But there was all these little tiny points that I was picking up on where, again, he's virtually the same age, only a month younger than Max. And yet his grammar and his pronunciation, and obviously what I could also see going back to that example where he was replacing the k sound with a t, is that in his, for lack of a better term, let's say in his neural pathways, okay, I like to use the term vocabulary more generally because and I'm sorry if I keep bumping this because I like to use my hands, so I'll have to kind of figure this out later. I don't know if that's causing a problem or not, but I like to use the term vocabulary rather than neural pathways and all that stuff, because what science understands as how neural pathways and work and so forth, it's like a total overemphasis on neural pathways. So I think a lot of people have this belief that it's like your knowledge is stored in your brain in your neural pathways, and like that's what knowledge is. But that's only one part of the whole picture. Okay, your whole body is processing information, and so it's more effective generally to say something's in your vocabulary rather than to say you have a neural pathway, because that's only one little part of it. Okay, but just going back to the point, the little boy, when you think of the neural pathway for t versus the neural pathway for k, there was no distinction between the two, because when I would kind of test him in a different context other than the word okay versus ote, with the word cut and tut, and I would ask him, like, do you mean cut? Can you say cut? He would just say tut. And he's not picking up on the subtle differences between those two. Now, this is something that I'll bring up to the mother. I mean, of course, I'm building that relationship with her, because you have to also be careful when you're talking to people, because parents, I've noticed, and I've even seen this within myself, so it's just a point of self-honesty, is we as parents tend to become defensive when someone questions something about our children, even if it's done within the intention of I'm trying to help you, right? But in reality, that doesn't help. It doesn't help you as a parent. It doesn't help your child either. But of course, that's where sales skills and self-awareness and stuff come into play. But of course, my point is now that I'm seeing it's a very specific point of, okay, it's not just this one little word, maybe where it's like a cute thing he's doing. It's clearly, I've seen in other words too now, that because I started testing the point talking to the little boy, he's not seeing that, he's not hearing the difference between those two words. That will cause a massive problem later on in terms of reading if it was not going to be corrected. Okay, and this is one of the things that if you want support with something like that, TechnoTutor as a foundational tool will support greatly within preventing a lot of problems like that later down the road. And if for no other reason, even though there's a lot more behind it, which I won't go into in this video, if for no other reason, then you're addressing it. And you're doing something and you're catching it early on. The earlier you can catch things, the better. But a lot of times parents are not even noticing these things or realizing that it's a problem. And so by the time you're 6 or 7 years old, that natural learning ability that I was talking about earlier, it's like a window where you're just automatically absorbing this kind of just naturally, easily. And if you're a parent, you'll notice this with your kids, especially if you're a parent who has kids beyond the 6 and 7, is that after that 6 and 7 year age range, and it's sometimes earlier, like 3 to 5 for some kids, after that window, it becomes hard to learn new things, like absorb. That's why the school system, I was mentioning this in the very beginning of this video, that's why the school system overemphasizes just rote memorization versus full understanding, because they know some kids sort of have a more developed like rote memorization muscle, if you want to call it that, and other kids don't. So that separates everybody into the F through A range, right? When you have a more photographic type memory, that's the children who tend to make A's and so forth. I wouldn't say I had a photographic per se memory. Well, depends on how you define photographic, because I've heard people describe photographic memory as they can literally look at a page and repeat every word on the page and so forth. I definitely never had a memory like that, when I was growing up. But it was photographic from the perspective of I could sit in class and I could not pay attention, and then I could remember most of the stuff that they said, and I could repeat it, and I could do the problems and all that stuff, which is very useful in school in terms of the way school is set up and designed. And that's where the people go towards more becoming doctors and lawyers, is the ones who are good at memorizing shit but not understanding it because of, well, there's a whole reason for that, obviously. But the point is, as a parent, if you're not building your child's foundation effectively from the beginning, what happens is when that natural learning ability window starts to close, it's very difficult to make an impact in that. Now, I know that, and I'll just say, based on our experience with our kids and with people we've worked with, that TechnoTutor can support children and adults even beyond that window. But let's just say you take TechnoTutor out of the equation for a moment. The best time to support a child is in the very beginning stages. Now, why is it? Now, the reason I bring up TechnoTutor, obviously, in one context, is because I don't want anyone to go into despair of like, well, what if they're already outside of that window? Well, let's show you what it can do. Okay, I'm not going to make you any promises. You can see for yourself. How about that? But even in that context, why is it still better? Because I wouldn't want someone to think, well, I got plenty of time, we'll just address it later. The problem is, even if you have TechnoTutor, now you're having to also overcome the child's built up sort of sense of self and identity of, I'm not very good at learning anymore, or certain things are hard. Like, I'm not a math person, I'm a literature person. You always have these dichotomies in school. Like, I'm more of an English language arts person. Well, mathematics is a language, and it's primarily English, or at least based on the same roots as English, like Greek and Latin and so forth, generally speaking. It's generally using the English language as the foundation of mathematics. So it's just another set of vocabulary is really all it is. So when someone says I'm bad at math, it just means you don't have that vocabulary. Like, I could say I'm bad at painting, but that just means I don't have the vocabulary of a painter, and I'm not performing the actions of living that vocabulary automatically in an effective way. So I'm not a painter. I don't have the vocabulary of a painter, or I don't have the vocabulary of, any number of things that you don't have the vocabulary on, that we think we're bad at that. And it's like this self-judgment that we go into as I'm not that kind of a person. But that's really a lie. It's really a myth that we have certain types of people, and certain people are for certain professions and certain people are for other professions. That's a lie that we've all bought into, that has been taught to us by the industrialists, let's just call it that for lack of a better term at the moment, who created the education system to create a specialized society where you have a few in jobs that pay very well, and then the middle, and then the lower income, the working class, let's say, that really don't utilize much spoken vocabulary in their jobs. It's mostly physical labor type of things, right? And then you have obviously a sort of a gradient there. You have gradations of all those different points, and the further you go up in income, the more it's vocabulary based, with the exception of things like sports and things like that. But then what you will find on that side of things is the athletes who have a higher vocabulary with business and finances. Those are the ones like your Shaquille O'Neal, who end up becoming mega wealthy even beyond just their basketball and all that kind of stuff. So even in those contexts, when you think they're getting paid a lot for their physical skill, yeah, but most athletes, in fact, end up dead broke only a few years after they retire, because they don't have the other vocabulary to supplement, right? Because when your physical innate abilities, let's say, start to deteriorate, you have to fall back on your vocabulary, right? And this is what separates the guy who gets passed up for the promotion 9 times out of 10, let's say, because he didn't keep advancing in his vocabulary, right? So I guess the bigger point I want to make with this video, though, is that as a parent, you have a responsibility to make sure that your child is well educated. You cannot put that on the school, especially when you understand that the school system is not designed to influence your child's ability to learn. So whatever foundation they get from you, that's the foundation they're going into school with. Okay, so I was telling a story in the beginning about a story that one of our distributors was telling me. And to go back to that point, I had said that there was this teenager who couldn't understand algebra, but it turns out he didn't have a foundation, like even knowing if he asked him what's the difference between 8 and 7, he didn't understand what that question meant, because he didn't understand the context of the word difference in math. And I had asked this distributor, I said, does his mom know the answer to those questions? And he said, yes, because he asked her. Well, then how come the child doesn't? And the without going into all the details, the short answer that was given by the parent was it was the school's fault. But, if the parent knows these things and the child doesn't know these things, how is it the school's fault? How can you say that it's the school's fault? Because as a parent, like I'm sitting there with this little boy that's not even my child, and I'm picking up on the fact that he can't tell the difference between ka and ta. Now, do I have the awareness that that's something that's important? Yes. But this is also part of the problem, is that the parents themselves are not understanding what's important, right? Well, here's the sad news. The teachers don't either. And even the teachers who are specialized in those fields, who would understand the difference, they don't know how to do anything about it. And I know because I've talked to many of them. I've talked to ones with master's degrees, PhDs in early childhood education. And even when I show them, look, we have a technology, it supports with these points that you're not able to physically support with. Of course, there comes that defensiveness, right? Just like the parent is being defensive about, oh, you're saying I'm parenting my child wrong or my child's stupid. Like, no. I'm helping you understand that there's a problem, right? It's like, even as these learning specialists and so forth, they become very defensive. And they say, well, show me the research where it shows that your thing is the answer. And so I show them the research. Here it is right behind me, right? Because all of it shows that what we're addressing is the issue, right? They were supposed to have read all that research. And what's interesting is they'll start to argue with me about the research. And then when I show them, here's what it is, then it's like this cognitive dissonance sets in. And what I've heard from many different reading, experts, early childhood experts that have refused to really look at what we're doing, And I think there's sort of like that survival mechanism, like they're in a certain position. If they start to question things, kind of like a doctor who doesn't want to question like whatever the thing is that they should be questioning, right? People come and they say, well, I cured my whatever from doing this thing that's not part of the medically recommended thing. And they're like, that's not possible. And they'll have some kind of cognitive dissonance about it, right? And then you have the doctors who are more open, obviously. But for the ones who have not been open, I remember having a conversation with someone one time, and I know they had at least a master's, if not a PhD in early childhood development or something like that. And when we were talking about Max and where he was, this was at like 2.5 years, I think. And so at that point, Max had already mastered the alphabet, the numbers 1 through 20, in terms of automatic recognition, and a few other things. And that's a point where now Seneca is at. She's not all the way through all the numbers. I think she's up to 12, I think Katie said to me last time. So all the numbers plus 1 through 12. And she's not even 2 yet. She's basically, I think, 20 months old. So she's a little bit even faster than where Max was at. But when this was at this point, when I was having this conversation with this reading specialist, Seneca wasn't. She was just like an infant, I think, if she was even born yet. But Max had basically mastered all these points that I just mentioned. And her response, without even being open to looking at what we're doing, was, well, he's just obviously very smart. And I was like, well, I mean, why do you say that? Because now think about it. What is she saying? He's smart. That's why he knows that stuff, right? And I said, well, how do you know he's just smart? She said, well, I mean, obviously, you and your wife are very smart, and he knows all that stuff so clearly. And I'm like, so what you're saying is he knows all that stuff because he's smart. But the reason you know he's smart is because he knows all that stuff. And it's because Katie and I are smart. But you have a PhD, which means you would be very smart. And you're not able to do that with any of the children you've ever worked with, even at 5 and 6, to get them to the same level of recognition and automaticity within that. And of course, that conversation went nowhere because she wasn't even willing to listen and consider, hey, there's a possibility that there's something that's not in the quote official channels, that's not part of the system that she was educated within, but that is providing a solution. But think about this. How many times has the academics provided the solution to anything? It's almost always been business. It's almost always been business. Can you imagine like the iPhone being invented by a university, And I know like in some cases, like the internet was invented by academics with funding from the military, and there's certain contexts, all right? But that also has to do with probably a lot more context there. But what I'm saying is, if you are expecting that a university is just going to come up with some solution and then it's going to become something, versus a business is going to take the available research and then come up with a solution and implement it, which do you think is more likely to happen? And so it's now what happens though is we're so used to the idea that research supports something. And where do we get that from? It's from the medical industry, I would think primarily. But we don't look at why. It's because the medical industry has billions and billions of dollars and they're paying for the research to be done. But that's by law. They have to have research done on these drugs, right? But by law, you can create an iPhone. You don't have to have any research that backs it up. Of course, if you want to be persuasive, you might have some research that you've done or at least culminated to put together to say, here's the research, right? And that's why a lot of companies have white papers. But did you know that I honestly, I don't know of any other, educational type products where they have like, okay, they did the research in a lab, here's the results and so forth. It's always white paper style where they take existing research and then they frame it in a way that it seems to support what they're doing. But that's very easy to do. The problem is they don't look at all of the research and they don't culminate all of it. If I were to do that, the best way to do that for TechnoTutor, just so you understand, is to just give you all of those volumes. And actually there's one that's missing. One of the early childhood education one, or early literacy one is missing. Just read all of those and you'll see there's nothing in there that you can find that contradicts what we're doing, but everything supports it. But what's even better about that is you don't have to do that. You can just see it for yourself. It works, right? I mean, I'm not here to start making some claims because we have to be careful about what we say and don't say, but I can tell you, I haven't seen anything else that can do anything close to this. But don't take my word for it. Just look at my kids, look at the other people who are using it and giving their testimonials. That's the best way. But what's even better is you can just look at it for yourself and evaluate it for yourself. You can see that it'll do what we're talking about. But going back to, the point with this little boy and the schools and so forth is, if that kid goes to school in a year or two, or however, whenever his parents decide to put him in school, those issues that he's having aren't going to be addressed like, oh, okay, he needs to differentiate between ka and ta. All right, here's the thing. Let's work on it. Done. A week later, it's gone. It's good. He's good. He's done. No, it's going to be, oh, he's dyslexic, or he's developmentally impaired, or X, Y, or Z. And so he's going to have to be in the special classes because his brain can't tell the difference between the two. Right? In other words, what the school system typically does is they take the symptom and then it becomes the problem in itself instead of figuring out how to actually address the root cause. Right? So if you're interested in considering root causes and so forth within education, that's why you would want to look at TechnoTutor. Okay, and you can see it for yourself. I'll just leave it at that. All right, so hopefully I've given some context today that's been useful or valuable for you in terms of why, as a parent, you don't want to just simply trust the school system to educate your child. Just kind of told a few stories and so forth. But there's obviously so much more we could go into. We have tons and tons of videos. Go check out my YouTube channel, youtube.com/user/Cameron V Cope, CameronVCope. That's my YouTube channel. I have a bunch of playlists with me and other people, my wife, other people within TechnoTutor and so forth that are kind of giving their perspective, testimonial videos, also videos of my kids going back from since Max was like, I think 16 or 18 months old, and now my daughter and so forth. You can see all that stuff. Check it out. There's also a lot more perspective that we give on there, just more generally about the system that we live in, not just education, but the system more broadly. The reason why we focus on education so much is because it's the foundation of our society. How we educate our children is the foundation of that. And so if you want to have a society where everyone just follows the authority, then you put the children in school from a young age and teach them to follow the authority. And that's what we have. If you want a society where people are sovereign individuals, exercising freedom in a responsible way that actually improves the balance in a way that's best for everybody, well, then you have to take responsibility as a parent and educate your child that way. Otherwise, we're just going to keep getting the same thing over and over and over. All right. So thanks for watching so far. I hope that was useful. And I will end it there and see you on the next one. All right. And please share this video if you're watching it on Facebook. Please give it a share so other people can watch it too. All right. See ya.